What is a variable? To summarize up front, a variable is a concept or measure of something that varies. This video discusses variables in two ways: what their function in research is, cause and effect as variables, and what kind of information they describe, a categorical versus continuous data. We think about variables in a variety of ways in political science. It might be a letter in an equation, a column in a data set, or more generally, a measure of a concept. We'll use variables in all of these ways, but our focus for this first month is on the concept itself. In this video, I will talk about the different functions of variables, cause and effect, for example, but also about the type of data that we find in variables. Let's start with what's most important: variables as concepts. Looking at ideas in a scientific way means being clear about what we mean by that idea and how it relates to other things. Our primary focus here is going to be on causal relationships. So we can use the word variable to describe a cause. An independent variable is the technical term, but there are lots of other words for it. We can also describe an effect, the dependent variable, because it depends on the change of the cause. But as we think about cause and effect, we often talk about other variables as well. For example, let's look at the theory of the democratic peace. This is the rare empirical truth in political science. No two democracies have ever gone to war with each other. The cause, two democracies, and the effect, peace, are clear. But no one really understands how democracy leads to peace. One theory argues that liberal ideas shape political thought and political institutions in a democracy, making the idea of attacking another democratic state problematic and creating constraints on leaders from doing so. In this case, the cause is liberal ideas, but we need to define the intermediate steps, or intervening variables, like institutions and constraints, in order to make the relationship with the effect, peace, clear. Another way we think about variables is in establishing causality. For example, there are many different reasons why a country might become more democratic. Modernization theory holds that economic development is the cause of transitions to democracy. But in order to show that that is true, you have to rule out all other explanations of democratic transitions. Here I have highlighted one alternate explanation: regional influence for or against democracy, which we call a control variable in this context. Showing that development causes democracy means showing that other explanations, these controls, do not. This is particularly important because in real life, it's often hard to tell what is a cause and what is an effect. For example, in their book Why Nations Fail, authors Ajimolu and Robinson try to explain why some countries end up in virtuous cycles. They are rich, stable, and democratic, while other countries are mired in poverty, high corruption, and political instability. In these cycles, it's hard to determine if a country is poor because it had a civil war, or if it had a civil war because it's poor. And we do need to identify what variable is the cause if we want to actually change it and improve the outcome, the effect. What's most essential to remember about variables, though, is the most obvious part. Variables vary. You can't have a variable that doesn't change, because if a cause doesn't change, we can't see if it made an effect change too. Sometimes this isn't very obvious. For example, many scholars are interested in studying the impact of ethnic diversity on economic growth. The challenge is that for many groups and in many places, ethnic diversity is pretty consistent over time. It does change over the long term, but the difference from one year to another in the ethnic makeup of the United States is much smaller than the difference between a diverse country like the United States, which has actually changed faster than most countries, and a group with a single dominant ethnicity, like South Korea. So if you want to use diversity as a variable, you either need data over a long time frame for a single location, or you need data for many locations, in the US or internationally. When you hear the word variable, though, you probably think of equations and numerical data. And don't worry, we will be using those later. In this context, I'd like you to focus on two things. First is the distinction between variables, observations, and values. Let's start with observations. These are the people or places we are studying. An observation can be an individual response on a survey, can be a state within the United States, It can be a city, it can be a country, but it is the unit we are analyzing. Two common phrases you'll hear in regards to observations are the N of a study, which just means the number of observations, and time series data, which essentially means we're looking at least one unit over time. Time series cross-sectional data varies both the time and the unit analysis. This is also called panel data. In contrast to observations, variables are the topics we are studying about these people or places, and values are the data itself. Let me use this example of what is called nominate data. Nominate scores are a variable that some scholars came up with to describe the ideology of a member of Congress based on all of their roll call votes when they were in office. Data on this measure are provided by session of Congress. What I'm showing you here is from the 92nd session of Congress, which was from 1971 to 1972. So that is the time frame. But data are also shown by member of Congress. That's the individual being studied. So this is an example of time series cross-sectional data. Varies over both time, session of Congress, and unit, member of Congress. The variables here include the state that person is from, their political party, and the ideology score itself. I've highlighted state as a variable, and note that the observation here is about the individual, not the place in this case. What you actually study is going to vary depending on your research and your research question. The value here then is what the variable for that observation is. So the variable varies, could be any state, but for this particular person, the value is Virginia. In a spreadsheet or data set like this, the observations are always going to be the rows, the variables are the columns, and the values are the data itself. The last thing that I wanted to discuss is the way that numerical variables can vary. There are two main types of numerical variables, categorical and continuous. Categorical variables have categories. A variable with two categories, like a yes-no answer to a question, is called a binary, or sometimes a dummy variable. Note that I just called a yes-no answer a numerical variable. That's because we typically write down a 1 for a yes and a 0 for a no if we want to use it in analysis. The other main type of categorical variable to remember is called an ordinal or ordered categorical variable. Some variables, like a person's religion, have categories, but you really can't rank them into any logical order. Ordinal variables can be ranked. For example, if the variable is a person's level of education, the lowest level would be elementary, then high school, then college graduate, and so on and so forth. In contrast to categorical variables, continuous variables are a range of numbers. For example, a person's income or the temperature outside both range from, say, 0 or below to higher numbers. These terms matter, partly just for vocabulary. You need to be able to understand what people are talking about when they use these terms, but it also does matter for analysis. You can only do certain types of statistics with certain types of variables. You can only make a cross-tabulation with a categorical variable, but you can only do OLS regression, this is the kind that we're going to learn, with a continuous variable. In class, we're going to practice learning about the types of variable and how well they define concepts by looking at variables describing democracy around the world.